Welcome to the Racially Just Schools podcast. In this episode, I discuss 3 ways that racism can show up in anti-racist work and spaces, particularly in schools and districts. My hope is to bring to the fore some of the insidious ways that racism can undermine our work, even when we have the very best intentions. As I discuss each way that racism can show up in anti-racist spaces and work, I also put forward and describe a set of questions that you and the people that are working on your team, the people that you're working in solidarity and working with collectively, can begin to ask to make your work more anti-racist and racially just. Before we get into today's episode, I want to remind you that this podcast is brought to you by www.raciallyjustschools.com. And when you join our community today, I'll send you a free video on how to make your racial justice work better. I'm excited about you joining the community. I look forward to meeting you. And now for today's episode, I hope you enjoy it. Let's go.
You're listening to the Racially Just Schools podcast, the show that provides resources to help you and your team build racially just schools. Now, here's your host, Dr. Terrance L.
Welcome to the Racially Just Schools podcast. My name is Terrance Green and I'm your host, and I am super excited that you are back for another episode, or this may be your first time joining. Regardless, I'm super excited that you're here. Now, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about something that's very important, and I haven't heard a lot of people talk about it as much, so I actually wrote a blog post on it, and it got a lot of attention, and I got a lot of positive feedback from people because it really resonated with them. And so today, what we're going to talk about is 3 ways that racism shows up in anti-racism work and what you can do about it. All right. So now this is super important because I'm going to share some questions that I think will help guide the work of your collective leadership team, the folks that you're working in solidarity with, that will help to reorient you around this work. But before I get started with that, a couple of things that I want to say is that, one, I'm very excited that the work of anti-racism is picking up. Racial equity, racial justice has been picking up in schools a lot since the summer of 2020. Everything that happened in 2020 with the continuous murders of Black people by the hands of white vigilantes and law enforcement has really caused a mainstream awakening around this racial reckoning. And the reason that I say a mainstream awakening is because anti-racist work in schools or anti-racist work and racial justice work at large is not anything that's new. In fact, Black folks, Asian folks, Latinx, Latino, Latina, indigenous folks have been engaged in this work since the beginning of time. So this isn't new work. It's newer in the mainstream. And you see the uptake of white folks too, beginning to do this work in ways. Now, here's the thing. I really think this work has great potential to be very transformative in schools. And as we think about the orientation of work really focusing on anti-racism and racial justice, we also have to be vigilant, right? We have to be diligent and vigilant to make sure that the same racism that we're working to confront does not show up in our anti-racist spaces under another name. And so today I want to share with you 3 ways that racism shows up in anti-racism space and then what you can do about it. As we think about how racism shows up in anti-racism spaces, I think it's first important for us to start to develop some collective understanding that we have a similar entry point into what we're talking about when we say racism. Now, one of the things I want to be super clear on is that there are very nuanced and complex definitions of racism. As a social scientist, as a professor, there's some amazing theories that really go into race and racism and racial formation that I think are very applicable and important. But for this conversation, I want to start by using a definition by Dr. Beverly Tatum. And what she defines racism as, she defines it as a system of advantage based on race, right? And so essentially that system of advantage based on race It benefits white folks, and not only does it disadvantage or marginalize black folk or Latinx, Latino, Latina, Asian, or indigenous folks, but it can literally kill us, right? So it's not just like we're disadvantaged. No, it can literally lead to death, and death on multiple levels: spiritual, intellectual, physical, psychological, like all these types of deaths and violences. But what I want to establish here is that with this definition is that racism is a system of advantage based on race. And the reason I think that this is a useful definition, particularly for this conversation, is that it moves racism beyond just individual animus or individual prejudices or individual ideology, and it moves it to a larger system, right? Thinking about the things that make up systems like institutional policies, thinking about cultural messages, thinking about the actions and the belief of the people within the system. And this definition is important because it helps to shift us from thinking about racism individually and to start thinking about it systematically, right? So that there are these larger systems and structures that are at play when we think about confronting racism and the ways in which it can show up in anti-racist spaces. Dr. Tatum also provides another useful idea to help us kind of make sense of this. In her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, she also offers this sort of a metaphor for racism as smog, right? That racism is like the smog that is inhaled and breathed in and exhaled. And again, these are not perfect metaphors. Language is wholly imperfect, but it allows an entry point to set up what we're going to talk about here today. But the thing I like about the use of the metaphor of racism as smog are a couple things. One, it underscores the persistence of racism, right? How racism it endures, it's persistent, that it is ever present, that it is there. Second, it describes, which I think is super important, it describes the everyday covert, taken for granted ways that racism is accepted as normal, right? So if you think about smog and air and the things that we breathe in, it's just like, that's what we do. We inhale, we exhale, we breathe in. There has to be oxygen, there has to be air. But even mixed in that air and oxygen, there can be smog. But because it is such a natural rhythm to inhale and exhale, we can often take for granted actually inhaling and exhaling, right? And so the same thing is true for racism, that this metaphor allows us to start to understand racism as like these everyday acts, these taken for granted things, the covert ways in which they happen, and they've been so normalized that people just say, well, that's just the way things are, right? And it moves us beyond just thinking about the spectacular ways in which things happen in very horrific ways, but also allows us to see the everyday mundane ways in which racism plays out. And to be clear, racism is a constant, right? Racism, not an aberration, but it's naturally baked into society, right? Not just in the US, but we can think about the global project of racism and of white supremacy. There's another definition of racism that I think will be useful for what we're talking about here today. And it's the one put forth by Dr. Cedric Robinson. And essentially is this: racism is a system that distributes resources, opportunities, and power based on the construct of race. I'll say that again. Racism is a system, again, moving away from these individual notions about what racism is, but framing it as racism as a system that distributes resources, opportunities, and power based on the construct of race. With these definitions in mind, I now want to spend some time talking about 3 ways that racism shows up in anti-racism work and what you can do about it. And as we talk about these 3 ways, I am going to invite you and the people that you are working in solidarity with, that you are really doing racial justice work with, to reflect on deeply and ponder and have some very radical dialogue around a set of questions that I think will be able to help to shift your practices in some profound ways. So let's get started. Okay, the first way I want to share with you today about how racism shows up in anti-racism work is through white people being deemed as the central anti-racism experts. White people are deemed and they're positioned as the central anti-racism experts. Now, to be clear, I'm always down for white folk who are, willing to be co-conspirators, who are willing to do what James Baldwin said. They're willing to go for broke, right? So I'm always down for that. But there is something extremely problematic when white folks are positioned as the central and primary experts of anti-racism work, while Black, Latinx, Latino, Latina, Asian, indigenous folks are on the margins and viewed as not worthy of having something to contribute. That is deeply problematic. And it is further problematic because this positioning further benefits white people, right? So if we go back to the definition from Dr. Beverly Tatum, it is a system of advantage based on race that advantages white people. So even in the attempt to do anti-racist work, when it's centered around the experiences, the wisdom, and the knowledge of white people, while, Black folks are on the margin and what we bring and what we contribute to this, then that is a production or reproduction of racism. But it gets even worse. It's when Black pain can turn into white fiscal gain. That's a problem, right? That white people monetize Black pain by being centered and by being primary experts in this work is deeply troubling. Another way in which this shows up, it shows up through white administrators, but also through white families becoming very resistant to the work, to the point to where they slow down not only the pace, but also the depth of the work because of fear and because of discomfort. And one of the things I like to say, a lot of schools, they practice I call it selective discomfort, because all of a sudden they want to slow the pace and the depth of racial justice work down because some white people are uncomfortable, but they never had this conversation about discomfort when Black students were being suspended all day long, right? When, Latino, Latina students were being funneled into special education for no apparent reasons and not getting the resources and the supports that they needed. And so all of a sudden there's this thing about, people are uncomfortable, but you're selective in how you position this idea of who gets to have comfort and who doesn't get to have it. But a lot of times this work gets slowed down, the depth of what can be done, because people are trying to placate, specifically white people. But what might you do instead? So I think there's something that you can do instead. The work should be started, centered, and integrated throughout should be the perspectives, the wisdom, the lived experiences of Black, of Indigenous, of Asian, and of Latino, Latina, and Latinx folks, right? This is important that you start with this. You don't add on. You start with this, you center this, and you integrate it throughout everything that you do with your anti-racism work. And this is important because it can do two things among many. Number one, it can significantly expand the possibilities, right? When we begin to center this work around what is it that Black folks bring? What is it that Indigenous folks bring? It begins to expand the possibilities of the work. But number two, it begins to shift the relational power dynamics. So in other words, the shift in the power dynamics by centering, integrating throughout, and starting with the perspectives, lived experiences of Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latina, and Asian folks is that the work is not built around what is palatable to white folks, but the work is now built around what is needed for Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Asian folks to not only survive, but to thrive and to be fully human. And the beauty of this is that the work, when you take it up in these ways, can start to be transformative for everybody who's involved in it. And it can start to move white people beyond saying, I'm using my privilege to make things better in a white supremacy system. Instead, it'll start to shift their focus to working to destroy the conditions that promote white supremacy in the first place so that we can build something that is racially just and radically different. So here are a few questions that you and the folks that you are working with to build racially just schools can begin to ask. Number one, with whose experiences, wisdom, and expertise do we start and center our anti-racism work? I'll read it again. It says, with whose experiences, wisdom, and expertise do we start and center our anti-racism work? The second question is, how might we make sure that when Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latinx, and Asian youth and adults share their lived racial experiences, that it results in larger systems changes? The third question is, how might we make sure that Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latinx, and Asian experiences, wisdom, and expertise are central to the anti-racism work that we do? And number four, at whose pace and depth is our anti-racism work progressing, and why? At whose pace and depth is our anti-racism work progressing, and why? And another question I will share with you all today, which is a bonus question. It was not in the original blog post, but I think is a profound and powerful question for you all to grapple with. And that question is this: is our anti-racism work centered around what is palatable for white people in the existing white power structure? Or is it centered around what is needed and necessary for Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latino, and Latinx people to thrive and to be fully human? The second way I want to spend some time talking about how racism shows up in anti-racist work is this way. It's by using anti-racist language, but maintaining a racist power structure. It's by using anti-racist language, but maintaining a racist power structure. So let me give you an example of kind of this idea in a story. So my dad loves to paint. And so myself and my two older brothers, we would help him paint. He would paint everything. And one of the things that he would paint was houses. And so, my brothers and I, we actually helped him paint a few houses. And I'll tell you, there is nothing like putting a fresh coat of paint on a house to make it look absolutely beautiful, gorgeous. However, here's the thing. Just by putting a fresh coat of paint on the exterior of a home does not change the structural foundation of the house, right? So you can have this house looking beautiful on the outside. It's painted all types of beautiful colors, but that does not do anything to the structure, the way in which the house is built, the way in which the house is maintained, the way in which the house is allowed to function. It doesn't change that. And similarly, to use language like liberation and anti-racism and equity and racial justice, but to maintain the power structure is just like putting a fresh coat of paint on a house with a broken foundation. It may look good externally, but it is deeply and severely flawed and problematic internally, right? So what this means is we know that language is imperfect, right? However, language is not just is not neutral, and language also is a conveyor of power, right? The ways in which we take up language, the language that we use is also an expression of power, but the thing is, like, even radical notions of language, using language around anti-racism and equity, you can still use that language, but maintain the same power structure that you had going on. So for an example, here's one of the ways in which this shows up in school districts and schools. They do the exact same things, right? So they engage in the same practices. They have the same policies. They have the same organizational culture and routines, but they add the words like equity. They add words like racial justice. They add words like anti-racism. They add words like liberation to their district or their school documents, their website, their mission statement, into all their materials that are like publicly facing. But one quick way to know whether or not the work in your school is anti-racist or racially just is that it will result in some type of racially just distribution, right? This distribution can be in time, it can be in fiscal resources, it can be in opportunities. So stay tuned, because in my book, I have an entire chapter on this, because a lot of times the cloak and the mask of doing this work and just, saying it or just having a conversation about it, and a conversation is important. But there has to be some racially just redistribution of the way things are, right? But the good news is you can do something different or otherwise than what you've always done. So instead of starting with building anti-racist, liberating, and racially just language, what if you started with building anti-racist processes, anti-racist school systems, anti-racist relationships of power, anti-racist assessments, anti-racist curriculum, anti-racist instruction? This might mean that the language that you use for your work will evolve, and that is okay, right? So to do so, you and your team might work through some of the following questions. Here are 3 questions for you. Number 1, what are the primary systems that make our school or our school district function, in terms of like instruction, collaboration with families, course assignments, things of that nature, and how might we reorient these systems to be anti-racist? So this first question is about what are the primary systems that make our school function, and then how might we reorient these to be anti-racist? The second question is, in what ways will we describe our processes for relating to each other as adults in the school or in the district, with youth and with families? And then how might we reorient these processes to be anti-racist? So the second question is like, in what ways will we describe our processes for relating with each other as adults in the school building or in the district, but also with youth and also with families, and particularly families who are minoritized by race and by, other social constructions and categories? And then the third question is, in what ways do unequal power relationships show up in our school, right? In what ways do these unequal relationships of power show up in our schools? And what might we do to reorient the relationships of power to be more anti-racist? All right, the third way in which racism shows up in anti-racist work and in spaces and schools and districts is this third way, where racial diversity and access become the main goals. Okay. This third way is that racial diversity and access becomes the main goals. And I want to be clear, because I can hear y'all like, oh my God, this is heresy. What is he talking? What is the brother talking about? So let me just be clear. I want to be clear that racial diversity is important. Okay. It is very important. However, racial diversity alone is not enough to interrupt systemic and structural racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, right? So opening up access in school districts and schools, that is important. For example, you might include having more Black students in advanced courses, right? And that has its place, and that's important. And I understand why it's important for a number of reasons. But what does it mean to provide access, if we continue with this example, for Black youth into courses that are quote unquote advanced, but their experiences are even more academically, culturally, and psychologically violent, right? So it's not enough to just say, oh, we want to put more Black students in advanced courses, but you put Black students in those advanced courses, and they're in these advanced courses where white supremacy culture, where their intellect is always doubted, where they are demeaned and completely marginalized and erased. So that is no good, right? Therefore, access, when it's combined with racial diversity, are still not enough to destroy the insidious ways that racism and anti-Blackness and white supremacy have been so deeply ingrained into schools, into school districts. But now here's the thing. Again, it's not enough to just provide, Black students and indigenous students, Pacific Islanders and Asian students and Latino, Latinx students access into a white supremacy system. Our work instead should be to destroy these systems and to rebuild something that is more equitable and racially just. So, but the good news is you can do something instead. So what might you do instead towards anti-racism, right? Instead, what if you and the people that you're working with at your school, on your team, in your district, on your school board, in the communities and families, with the staff, what if you and the people that you're working with radically reorient yourselves to new meanings about advancement, about opportunities, and about access? This will require us to start deconstructing, but also reconstructing, right? And so to do so, there are a couple of questions that you and the folks that you're working collectively with, the folks on your team, can begin to ask. There are 4 questions. Question 1 is, what does our school mean by advancement? What does our school mean by opportunities? And what does it mean by access? And to what ends, right? To what ends are we trying to provide access to, advanced courses, or access to trajectories and pathways and education that have been foreclosed and closed off to Black students, for example? Question 2, who benefits and who does not based on these current conceptions of advancement, opportunities, and access? What racial and cultural ways of being are we missing when we rely solely on these traditional notions of what advancement, opportunities, and access mean? The third question is, how might we reorient our notions of advancement, opportunities, and access to be anti-racist, right? These first couple of questions are just getting a sense of how it's set up and its functions and structures in your school. But this third question is now asking us to be more expansive, to think about how might we rethink this to be anti-racist. And the fourth question is, whose perspectives might we have to center, and how, if we were to reorient our notions of advancements, opportunities, and access to be anti-racist? Okay, as we come to a close, my hope is that you found something useful in this episode. And my hope is that this will help you and your team continue to do racial justice work in very profound and deep and substantive ways that actually change lives, and it change systems, and we create a radically different future. My aim is, to help you identify some ways that racism continues to show up in anti-racist spaces, even with the best intentions, even when people are engaged in this work with a sense of vigilance, the ways in which the racism just continues, the permanence of it shows up. We have to be on the lookout and watch for it. And so my goal was to provide you, with some suggestions, some alternatives that you and your team might pursue otherwise. And that comes through the form of inquiry. It comes through the form of asking questions, right? The root of that word question is quest, like a pursuit, right? This is inquiry, right? And so these become starting points and entry points into the work. It becomes starting points and entry points into more depths of the work. And so I often like to think of questions to be kind of like the sparks to galvanize and to organize and to center the wisdom, the experience, and the perspectives of people on your team and that you're collaborating with. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please share it with folks on your team. Share it with folks in your school, folks in your district, folks in your network. It's incumbent upon us to continue to do this work and to spread it and to share it. So I'm going to ask you to share it with at least 4 people. And I would love if your team would just have conversations around this episode, and particularly these questions, and take them up and grapple with them. And I'd love to hear from you. So I hope you got something out of it. Well, that is it, folks. Thank you so much for joining Racially Just Schools podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and I am so excited and really looking forward to our time together during future podcasts. What I need you to do is to please hit the subscribe button, share with a friend, and please leave a review. Love reviews. And if you want to hear more from me, you can head on over to www.raciallyjustschools.com. That is www.raciallyjustschools.com. When you join our community, I have a free video for you on 3 tips that will make your racial justice work better. And again, if you love the show, hit subscribe, rate it, and leave a review on iTunes. And until next time, peace.